The ache in my lower back had become a constant companion over the past month, a dull throb that intensified every time I bent to polish the mahogany surfaces at Castellanos. The restaurant's signature scent of aged wine, simmering garlic, and leather upholstery clung to my uniform, a stark reminder of the world I observed but could never truly belong to. I pressed my palm against the small of my back, feeling the familiar twinge as I straightened from wiping down yet another table in the private dining section. The metallic taste of exhaustion coated my tongue as I moved between the tables, my reflection catching in the gleaming surfaces of wine glasses and silver cutlery. Each step sent a subtle wave of nausea through me, though I'd grown expert at hiding these moments behind professional smiles and efficient movements. The weight of my secret pressed against my ribs like a held breath, 3 months along, and still undetected by my supervisors. "Harper, table 12 needs attention," called James, the floor manager, his voice carrying that familiar edge of impatience that had grown sharper since the restaurant's recent acquisition by new ownership. His dark eyes followed my movements with the scrutiny of someone always looking for reasons to cut costs. The Vitelli party specifically requested our most experienced sommelier service. My hands stilled on the tablecloth I'd been adjusting. The name Vitelli carried weight in Chicago, whispered in the same reverent tones reserved for old money and older secrets. I'd heard fragments of conversations between the senior staff about the family's influence, their connections threading through the city's most exclusive establishments, like golden wire through expensive fabric. "I'm just wait staff," I reminded James, though my pulse quickened involuntarily. The irony wasn't lost on me that I possessed more wine knowledge than anyone else in this building, my palate trained through years of study that felt like a lifetime ago. Those credentials gathering dust in storage along with everything else from my previous life. "Tonight, you're whatever they need you to be," he replied curtly, already turning away. "Mr. Castellano wants everything perfect for this dinner. No mistakes, no delays, and definitely no reason for complaints." The weight of unspoken threats hung heavy in the air between us. I nodded, smoothing my black skirt and checking that my hair remained secured in its neat bun. The private dining room occupied the restaurant's most coveted space, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. Crystal chandeliers cast warm pools of light across intimate seating arrangements, each table a small theater for the city's elite. As I approached table 12, the soft murmur of conversation grew clearer, though the words remained indistinct. 3 men sat around the circular table, their expensive suits and confident postures marking them as individuals accustomed to having their preferences anticipated rather than requested. The youngest appeared to be in his late 20s, with perfectly styled dark hair and the kind of effortless elegance that only came from generational wealth. "Gentlemen, good evening," I began, my voice steady despite the flutter of nervousness in my chest. "I understand you're interested in wine pairings for this evening's meal." The man at the head of the table looked up, and I felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. Marcus Castellano. I'd seen him only in photographs scattered throughout the restaurant's publicity materials, but those images had failed to capture the intensity of his presence. Dark hair swept back from a face that belonged in Renaissance paintings, all sharp angles and classical proportions. His eyes, a deep brown that seemed to shift between warm amber and cold obsidian depending on the light, fixed on me with an attention that made my skin prickle. "The sommelier is indisposed this evening," I continued, falling back on the explanation James had provided. "But I'd be happy to assist with your selections from our wine list." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving my face. There was something predatory in his stillness, like a cat studying potential prey. "How convenient," he said, his voice carrying the faint trace of an accent that spoke of European summers and exclusive boarding schools. "Though I have to wonder about a restaurant that sends waitstaff to handle wine service for a $5,000 dinner." Heat crept up my neck, but I maintained my professional demeanor. "I assure you, sir, I'm quite knowledgeable about our wine collection. Perhaps if you could tell me about your preferences and the evening's menu selections, I could make some appropriate recommendations." One of his companions, an older man with silver hair and watchful eyes, chuckled softly. Marcus, perhaps we should simply order something familiar. A good Chianti, maybe something from Tuscany. Chianti, Marcus repeated, his attention still focused on me with an intensity that made breathing difficult. From Tuscany. What would you recommend for someone with such pedestrian tastes, miss? Harper, I supplied, ignoring the condescension in his tone. And if you're looking for something from the Chianti region, I'd actually recommend against the 2018 Castello di Monsanto you're probably considering. While it's certainly adequate, the tannin structure is rather aggressive for this evening's menu. The 2016 Reserva from the same producer would be a far superior choice, with better integration and a finish that won't overpower the osso buco I noticed being prepared in the kitchen. The silence that followed my response stretched taut as a wire. Marcus's expression had shifted from amused condescension to something sharper, more focused. His companions exchanged glances, clearly aware they were witnessing something unexpected. Interesting, Marcus said slowly, his fingers drumming against the white tablecloth. Most waitstaff would have simply recommended our most expensive bottle and called it expertise. You seem to have actual opinions about wine structure and food pairing. Where did you study? The question hit like a physical blow, threatening to crack the careful facade I'd constructed. I read a lot, I managed, the half-truth bitter on my tongue. And I pay attention to what works well together. Do you? It wasn't a question, but a statement laden with skepticism and something else. Interest, perhaps even intrigue. Tell me, what would you pair with tonight's antipasto selection? We're starting with the crudo di ricotta, then moving to the burrata with induja. My mind automatically began cataloging flavor profiles and complementary elements, years of training taking over despite my current circumstances. For the crudo, something crisp with good acidity to complement the fish without overwhelming the delicate preparation. The Sancerre from Domaine Henri Bourgeois would be excellent. The citrus notes will enhance the crudo's brightness. For the burrata and induja, you'll want something with enough body to stand up to the spice and creaminess. The Barbera d'Alba from Giacomo Conterno has the perfect balance of fruit and earthiness to bridge those contrasting elements. Marcus straightened in his chair, his full attention now locked on me like a spotlight. Those are both excellent choices, he said, and I caught the note of surprise in his voice. Specific producers, vintage considerations, flavor mapping. Either you're remarkably well-read for someone polishing tables, or you're significantly overqualified for your current position. The observation hung between us like a challenge, and I felt the first stirrings of genuine alarm. This was exactly the kind of attention I'd been working so hard to avoid. Questions about my background, interest in my qualifications, curiosity about how someone with my knowledge had ended up serving wine instead of selecting it for collectors and restaurants. I should get your wine selections to the sommelier, I said, taking a step back from the table. He'll want to approve the pairings before service. No. The word came out sharp, authoritative, brooking no argument. You'll handle our wine service tonight, all of it. I want to see what else you know. It wasn't a request, despite the polite phrasing. Marcus Castellano was clearly accustomed to having his preferences become reality through sheer force of will and undoubtedly extensive financial influence. The two men with him nodded their agreement, though I noticed they seemed more interested in observing the interaction than participating in the wine selection process. Sir, I'm not sure management would... Management will approve whatever I request, he interrupted smoothly. Given that I'm currently in the process of acquiring this establishment, I think I can determine how my money is best spent tonight. So, Harper, shall we continue our discussion about wine? Or would you prefer to explain to your supervisor why you turned down a direct request from the new owner? The revelation hit me like cold water. Marcus Castellano wasn't just a wealthy customer, he was my new boss, the man whose decisions would determine not only my employment, but the livelihoods of everyone working in this building. The careful distance I'd maintained between my knowledge and my position suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass. "Of course, Mr. Castellano," I said, my voice steady despite the racing of my pulse. "I'll be honored to handle your wine service this evening." His smile in response was sharp-edged and knowing, as if he'd sensed the exact moment my defenses had shifted. "Excellent. And Harper? I have a feeling this is going to be a very interesting evening indeed." The next 3 weeks passed in a carefully orchestrated dance of proximity and observation. Marcus Castellano had made his presence a fixture at the restaurant, arriving for dinner precisely at 8:30 each evening, and requesting the same table, the same section, and most significantly, the same wine service. What had begun as an evening's curiosity had evolved into something far more deliberate and unsettling. I found myself anticipating his arrival each night, my body responding to the knowledge of his impending presence with a mixture of dread and something I refused to acknowledge as anticipation. The other staff had begun to notice the pattern, their glances carrying questions I couldn't answer, and speculation I preferred not to hear. James had stopped questioning the arrangement after receiving what he described as very clear instructions from ownership, leaving me to navigate these encounters without the buffer of management oversight. Tonight felt different from the moment I walked through the employee entrance. The usual dinner crowd seemed thinner, conversations more subdued, and several tables in the main dining room remained conspicuously empty despite our typically packed reservation book. I tied my apron with hands that had developed a slight tremor over the past few days, a side effect of both my condition and the stress of maintaining my careful facade under Marcus's increasingly penetrating attention. "Harper," called Sophia, one of the senior waitresses, her voice carrying an odd note of sympathy. "Table 12 is asking for you specifically. Again." She paused, studying my face with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "You know, I've been working here for 6 years, and I've never seen anyone pay this much attention to wine pairings. Usually the wealthy ones just order the most expensive bottle and ignore everything else." I smoothed my uniform skirt, checking that the loose fit still concealed the subtle changes in my silhouette. At 15 weeks, I was running out of time before my secret became impossible to hide. "He's very particular about his preferences," I said, the understatement feeling hollow even as I spoke it. "Particular," Sophia repeated, her tone suggesting she had other words in mind. "Just be careful, okay? Men like that, they don't develop interests without reason." Her warning followed me as I made my way to the private dining section, past tables filled with Chicago's elite conducting business, over perfectly prepared meals and wines, selected to complement both their palates and their status. The familiar scent of aged leather and expensive cologne grew stronger as I approached table 12, along with something else, the sharp, clean smell of authority and barely contained power. Marcus sat alone tonight, which was unusual. Typically, his dinners involved at least 2 other men. Serious conversations conducted in low voices about subjects I'd learned not to listen to too carefully. The solitude made him seem larger somehow, his presence expanding to fill the entire corner of the room. He was reading something on his phone, his expression focused and slightly grim, but looked up the moment I approached. "Harper," he said, and I noticed he'd stopped using the formal miss that had marked our early interactions. "Right on time. I was beginning to think you'd been reassigned to other tables." "Good evening, Mr. Castellano," I replied, maintaining the professional distance that felt increasingly artificial. "Will your associates be joining you tonight?" "No. Tonight it's just us." The phrasing made my pulse quicken. I thought it might be interesting to focus entirely on the wine selection without the distraction of business discussions. I've been thinking about our conversation last week regarding the influence of terroir on Burgundian expressions, and I'd like to continue that exploration. The conversation he referenced had been anything but casual. Marcus had ordered a flight of wines from different Burgundy producers, then proceeded to engage me in a discussion that revealed not only his own considerable knowledge, but also drew out responses that showcased exactly how extensive my training had been. I'd caught myself mid-sentence several times, realizing I was providing the kind of detailed analysis typically reserved for master sommelier examinations. "Of course," I said, reaching for the wine list, though I'd long since memorized every selection. "Did you have particular regions or styles in mind?" "Actually, I was hoping you might surprise me." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes never leaving my face. "Select something you think I haven't tried. Something that would challenge assumptions about what makes a wine exceptional." The request was both flattering and dangerous. To truly surprise someone with his obvious expertise and resources, I'd need to reach deep into my knowledge base, to make connections and observations that went far beyond what any waitress should possess. But the challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and despite my better judgment, I found myself rising to meet it. "There's a producer in the Loire Valley," I began, my voice gaining confidence as I spoke. "Domaine de la Pépinière, run by Marc Olivier. They work with Muscadet grapes, which most people dismiss as simple seafood wine, but Olivier's approach to extended lees aging creates extraordinary complexity. The 2019 Clos des Briors has mineral notes that taste like drinking liquid stones, with a finish that lingers for minutes rather than seconds." Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. "Muscadet from a specific vineyard block, with detailed tasting notes about lees aging and mineral expression. Most people couldn't find the Loire Valley on a map, let alone discuss the nuances of individual producers." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "You continue to surprise me, Harper." Heat crept up my neck under his scrutiny. "Wine is a passion of mine," I said, the partial truth feeling inadequate but necessary. "A passion." He repeated the word as if tasting it. "Yes, I can see that. Passion has a way of revealing itself despite our best efforts to hide it." The observation felt loaded with meaning beyond wine, making my skin prickle with awareness. "Tell me, what other passions are you hiding behind that professional demeanor?" Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't lead down dangerous paths, my phone buzzed in my apron pocket. The sound was jarring in the intimate atmosphere of our conversation, and I saw Marcus's expression shift to something harder, more predatory. "I'm sorry," I said, reaching to silence the device. "Let me get that wine selection started for you." "Answer it," Marcus said, his tone carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Please, I insist." My hands trembled slightly as I retrieved the phone, Dr. Martinez's name displayed clearly on the screen. Missing this call wasn't an option. My next prenatal appointment was tomorrow, and any schedule changes needed immediate attention. But answering it in front of Marcus felt like stepping into a trap I couldn't see clearly. "Hello," I said, turning slightly away from the table in a futile attempt at privacy. "Ms. Harper, this is Dr. Martinez's office. We need to reschedule your appointment tomorrow afternoon. The doctor had an emergency come up, but we can fit you in Thursday morning at 9 if that works for your schedule." The words seemed to echo in the space between Marcus and me, each syllable a small revelation. I could feel his attention like heat against my back, his acute intelligence no doubt cataloging every detail of the conversation for later analysis. "Thursday morning would be fine," I managed, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. "Thank you for calling." "Great, we'll see you then. And remember to bring your insurance information and the results from your blood work." I ended the call and turned back to Marcus, whose expression had shifted to something unreadable, but undeniably focused. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, heavy with unspoken questions and dangerous implications. "Doctor's appointment?" he said finally, his voice neutral, but his eyes sharp with interest. "Nothing serious, I hope." "Routine checkup," I replied, the lie coming easier with practice. "Shall I get started on that wine selection?" But Marcus was no longer interested in wine. He leaned forward in his chair, his gaze traveling over my face with the intensity of someone solving a complex equation. "You know, Harper, I've been watching you for weeks now. The way you move, the way you think, the way you handle pressure. You're remarkably composed for someone working a service job, remarkably knowledgeable for someone without formal training, and remarkably careful for someone with nothing to hide." Each observation hit like a physical blow, and I felt my carefully constructed defenses beginning to crack under the weight of his attention. "I should really get that wine." "Sit down," Marcus said quietly, gesturing to the chair across from him. It wasn't a request, despite the polite phrasing. "I think it's time we had a more honest conversation." The command in his voice was unmistakable, backed by the kind of authority that came from owning not just this restaurant, but having the power to reshape my entire world with a phone call. I sank into the offered chair, my legs suddenly unsteady, and tried to prepare for whatever was coming next. "Now then," Marcus said, his smile sharp as a blade, "why don't you tell me what someone with your expertise in wine, your obvious education, and your careful attention to privacy is really doing serving tables in my restaurant?" The question hung between us like suspended judgment, and I felt the careful architecture of my new life beginning to crumble under the weight of Marcus's scrutiny. My hands found each other in my lap, fingers interlacing to hide their trembling as I searched for words that wouldn't complete my destruction. "I told you," I began, though my voice lacked conviction even to my own ears. "Wine is a hobby. I read extensively and—" "Harper." The single word cut through my explanation like a knife through silk. Marcus leaned forward, his elbows resting on the pristine white tablecloth, his dark eyes never leaving my face. "I've spent considerable time over the past 3 weeks researching wine education programs, sommelier certifications, and professional tastings in this city. I've also made some inquiries about exceptional candidates who might have disappeared from the industry recently." My breath caught in my throat. The implication of his words settled over me like ice water, and I felt the last vestiges of my anonymity slipping away like sand through desperate fingers. 3 weeks ago, you identified a specific vineyard block in the Loire Valley and discussed extended lees aging techniques with the precision of someone who spent years studying enology. Last week, you correctly identified the vintage of a Barolo by smell alone and provided tasting notes that matched sommelier-level assessments I found in Wine Spectator. Tonight, you're receiving calls from what sounds like a medical office, and you're clearly taking great care to hide something about your personal circumstances. Each point he made felt like another nail in the coffin of my carefully constructed fiction. I wanted to stand, to excuse myself, to run back to the safety of anonymity I'd worked so hard to build. But Marcus's presence held me in place like gravity, inescapable and absolute. "So let me ask you again," he continued, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, but somehow more commanding than any shout. "What is someone with your qualifications doing hiding behind a waitress uniform in my restaurant?" The silence stretched taut between us, filled with the soft clink of glassware and distant conversation from other tables. I could feel my pulse in my throat, could hear the subtle rasp of my own breathing in the space between his question and my inevitable answer. "I needed a job," I said finally, the words coming out smaller than I'd intended. "Something quiet? Something that wouldn't draw attention?" "Attention from whom?" The question came swift and sharp, confirming that Marcus had caught the implication immediately. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of months of careful planning crashing down around me. When I opened them again, Marcus was watching me with an expression that combined predatory interest with something that might have been understanding. "Someone who would prefer I remained invisible," I said, each word chosen with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. Someone whose influence extends far enough that traditional employment in my field became complicated. Marcus's expression shifted, his features hardening into something colder, more calculating. Someone with that kind of reach would have to be very powerful indeed. Government, perhaps? Or... He paused, his gaze sharpening. Someone in my line of work. The recognition in his voice sent fear coursing through my veins like liquid electricity. Marcus Castellano wasn't just wealthy or influential. The whispered conversations I'd overheard, the deference shown by staff and patrons alike, the casual way he'd mentioned acquiring the restaurant, all pointed to connections that operated in shadows and margins where traditional rules didn't apply. "I can't discuss it," I said, my voice barely audible. "I won't discuss it." "Can't or won't?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "There's an important distinction there, Harper. Can't suggests external pressure, threats, fear for your safety. Won't implies choice, loyalty, protection of someone else." He studied my face with the intensity of someone reading a complex text. "Based on your body language, I'd say we're dealing with can't, which raises very interesting questions about who has you so thoroughly frightened." I wanted to deny his assessment, to maintain some pretense of control over my situation, but the accuracy of his observation left me speechless. Marcus had read me like an open book, had seen through months of careful performance to the truth I'd been desperate to hide. "You're pregnant," he said suddenly, the statement delivered with such certainty that I felt my carefully maintained composure finally shatter completely. "What?" The word came out as barely more than a breath. "The medical appointments, the careful way you move, the subtle changes in your posture over the past few weeks." Marcus's voice carried no judgment, only clinical observation. 15, maybe 16 weeks based on the timing of when I first noticed the adjustments, which means you were already pregnant when you started working here, already hiding from whoever sent you into this careful invisibility. Tears burned behind my eyes, though I refused to let them fall. 3 months of careful planning, of building a new identity from nothing, of creating space for myself and my child to exist safely. And Marcus Castellano had unraveled it all in a matter of weeks simply by paying attention. "Please," I whispered, the word carrying all my desperation and fear. "I just need this job. I need to stay invisible for a little while longer." "Invisible," Marcus repeated, his tone suggesting he found the concept personally offensive. "Someone with your talents, your intelligence, your expertise, hiding behind a uniform and serving wine to people who couldn't appreciate a fraction of what you bring to the experience." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "What kind of monster puts a pregnant woman in a position where she has to choose between safety and survival?" The question hit too close to home, threatening to crack open wounds I'd been careful to keep sealed. "It's complicated," I managed. "Most interesting things are." Marcus signaled to someone beyond my field of vision, and moments later, a glass of water appeared at my elbow, along with a small plate of bread and olives. "Eat something," he said, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his concerns for others translated into immediate action. "And then we're going to discuss how I can help you." "I don't need help," I said, automatically, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Everyone needs help, Harper. The only variable is whether they're brave enough to accept it when it's offered." Marcus's voice carried a note of finality that suggested the conversation had moved beyond negotiation. "The question isn't whether you need assistance. It's whether you trust me enough to provide it." Trust. The word felt foreign after months of relying solely on my own resources and judgment. But as I looked across the table at Marcus Castellano, seeing something in his dark eyes that might have been genuine concern beneath the predatory intelligence, I realized I was facing a choice that would determine not just my immediate future, but the safety of my unborn child. "What kind of help?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's smile was sharp and satisfied, like a chess player who'd just achieved checkmate. "The kind that ensures no one can touch you or your child without going through me first. The kind that gives you back your power and your choices. He paused, his gaze intensifying. The kind that requires absolute trust and complete honesty in return. The offer hung between us like a bridge spanning a chasm, promising either salvation or a different kind of imprisonment. But as I sat there, feeling the weight of my secrets and the exhaustion of constant vigilance, I began to understand that Marcus Castellano might be offering me something I'd thought was lost forever. The possibility of safety, and perhaps even more dangerous, the possibility of hope. 3 days later, I found myself standing in the marble-floored foyer of a penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, my meager possessions reduced to a single suitcase, and the growing realization that I'd crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The space around me spoke of wealth so absolute it had transcended ostentation, settling instead into the quiet confidence of perfectly chosen materials and craftsmanship that would last centuries. Marcus emerged from what appeared to be a study, his phone pressed to his ear as he conducted a conversation in rapid Italian. His voice carried the same authority I'd witnessed at the restaurant, but here in his private domain. There was an additional layer of command that suggested this was where his true power resided. He gestured for me to sit on a leather sofa that probably cost more than I'd earned in the past 6 months, finishing his call with what sounded like very clear instructions about surveillance and territory. "Feeling overwhelmed?" he asked, sliding the phone into his jacket pocket and settling into the chair across from me. The question was posed casually, but his dark eyes missed nothing as they catalogued my reaction to my new surroundings. "This is temporary," I said, though the words felt like I was trying to convince myself as much as him. "Just until I can figure out something more permanent." "Harper." Marcus's voice carried that familiar note of amused patience. "We've discussed this. Temporary solutions don't address the fundamental problem of someone with enough reach to force you into hiding. Whoever you're running from isn't going to simply lose interest because you've changed apartments." The truth of his observation settled into my chest like a weight. Over the past 3 days, Marcus had demonstrated exactly how thorough his own resources could be. Within hours of our conversation at the restaurant, he'd arranged for my belongings to be moved from my cramped studio apartment, had somehow expedited a leave of absence from work that wouldn't raise questions, and had provided me with a level of security that made my previous attempts at anonymity look childishly inadequate. "You still haven't told me exactly what this arrangement entails," I said, my hands unconsciously moving to rest on my abdomen, where the subtle curve of pregnancy was becoming impossible to ignore. "What you expect in return for all this. Generosity." Marcus followed the gesture, his expression softening in a way that seemed genuine rather than calculated. "What I expect," he said slowly, "is honesty. Complete transparency about who you're hiding from and why. Full disclosure about any threats or complications that might affect your safety or that of your child." He paused, his gaze sharpening. "And trust that I'm capable of handling whatever situation drove you to take a waitressing job under an assumed name." The last point hit like a physical blow. "How did you—" Olivia Harper is a very talented sommelier who graduated from the Culinary Institute of America 3 years ago with exceptional credentials. Marcus's voice carried no accusation, only statement of fact. She completed advanced certifications in French and Italian wine regions, worked briefly at several prestigious establishments in New York, and then disappeared from the industry entirely about 8 months ago. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "What I can't find is any record of what happened to make someone with those qualifications vanish so completely that she felt the need to serve wine under a false identity." My carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. Hearing my real name spoken aloud after months of careful anonymity felt like being suddenly exposed under harsh light. "You hired investigators." "I hired protection," Marcus corrected, his tone suggesting the distinction was important to him. "Professional investigation was simply part of assessing the scope of potential threats. I needed to know what I was dealing with before I could effectively ensure your safety." "And what did you find?" The question came out smaller than I'd intended, fear and resignation warring in my chest. Marcus's expression grew darker, more predatory. I found evidence of someone with considerable resources systematically destroying your professional reputation, threatening your former employers, and creating an environment where traditional employment became impossible. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but somehow more menacing than any shout. I found traces of a very sophisticated campaign designed to isolate you completely. The accuracy of his summary left me breathless. For months, I'd lived with the weight of that systematic destruction, watching helplessly as doors closed and opportunities evaporated, until hiding seemed like the only viable option. Vincent Torino, I said, the name feeling like broken glass in my mouth. My former mentor, my former. I trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. The father of your child, Marcus finished, his voice carrying no judgment but considerable interest. Vincent Torino, who owns restaurants in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Vincent Torino, whose reputation for discovering and developing young talent is matched only by his reputation for destroying those who displease him. Marcus paused, studying my face with clinical precision. Vincent Torino, who has connections to several families that operate in the same, specialized business sectors that I do. The last observation sent fear coursing through my veins like ice water. If Marcus understood the full scope of Vincent's connections, then he also understood exactly how dangerous my situation had become. He offered me everything, I said, the words coming out in a rush now that the dam had finally broken. Mentorship, opportunity, a partnership in his new restaurant. He said I had exceptional potential, that he could make me one of the most recognized sommeliers in the country. I swallowed hard, the memory of my own naivety burning like acid. What he didn't mention was that his offer came with expectations that extended far beyond professional development. Marcus's expression had grown progressively colder as I spoke, his features settling into something that reminded me of Arctic ice. Beautiful, but absolutely lethal. He forced himself on you. He said it was part of the mentorship, I whispered, the shame of my own compliance still fresh despite months of trying to process what had happened. That successful women in the industry understood how business really worked, that I needed to prove my commitment to the partnership. I pressed my hands against my eyes, trying to block out the memory of my own desperate justifications. By the time I realized what was really happening, I was already pregnant and completely dependent on his support. And when you tried to leave, he made it impossible. The words came out flat, emotionless, drained of the anger that had sustained me through the worst of it. Suddenly, no one would return my calls. Job interviews were canceled without explanation. References I'd counted on claimed they'd never heard of me. Within weeks, I went from having multiple offers to being completely unemployable in my field. Marcus stood abruptly, moving to the window that offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline. His posture radiated controlled fury, the kind of barely contained violence that suggested Vincent Torino had made a very serious mistake in targeting someone who would eventually come to Marcus's attention. Vincent Torino made a critical error in judgment, Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He assumed that his reach was longer than mine, that his influence was more comprehensive than my own. He turned back to face me, and I saw something in his dark eyes that might have been the most dangerous thing I'd ever witnessed. He was catastrophically wrong. "What are you going to do?" I asked, though part of me was afraid to hear the answer. Marcus's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as lethal. "I'm going to make it very clear to Vincent Torino that you and your child are under my protection now. I'm going to ensure that his campaign of harassment ends immediately and permanently." He paused, his gaze softening slightly as it moved to my abdomen. "And I'm going to give you back the choices he stole from you." The promise felt too large to believe, too comprehensive to trust. But as I sat there in Marcus Castellanos' penthouse, surrounded by the quiet evidence of his power and protection, I began to understand that I'd found something I'd thought was lost forever. Someone with the resources and will to stand against Vincent Torino's influence. "What does that mean for me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What does this protection actually look like?" Marcus returned to his chair, his expression serious but not unkind. "It means you have choices again, Olivia. You can return to your career with the guarantee that no one will interfere with your professional development. You can raise your child with the security of knowing that threats and harassment are things of the past." He paused, his dark eyes searching my face. "Or you can stay here, with me, and discover what it means to be truly protected by someone who values what you bring to the world." The offer hung between us like a bridge to an entirely new life, promising safety, but also a different kind of dependency. As I looked at Marcus Castellano, seeing the genuine care beneath his predatory intelligence, I realized I was facing the most important choice of my life. The choice between independence and protection, between solitude and a connection that might be more dangerous than anything I was running from. 6 weeks had passed since I'd moved into Marcus's penthouse, and I was beginning to understand that protection came with its own form of captivity. The apartment had become a gilded cage, beautiful and secure, but increasingly suffocating as my pregnancy progressed, and my world shrank to the boundaries Marcus deemed safe. I'd gained 20 pounds, and lost most of my illusions about the simplicity of accepting help from a man whose business operated in shadows and moral ambiguity. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows as I sat at the marble kitchen island, picking at a breakfast I had no appetite for while scrolling through job listings on my laptop. Marcus had been true to his word about neutralizing Vincent's influence. My former mentor had apparently received a very convincing conversation about the consequences of continued harassment. But the return of my professional options felt hollow when I was essentially confined to a luxury prison. "You're not eating enough," Marcus observed, emerging from his study with a cup of coffee and the morning's newspapers. His daily routine included scanning both local and international publications, though I'd learned not to ask too many questions about what information he was seeking, or how it might affect his business decisions. "I'm eating plenty," I replied, though we both knew it was a lie. The stress of my situation had affected my appetite more than the pregnancy itself, leaving me struggling to maintain the nutritional requirements my doctor insisted were crucial for healthy development. Marcus set his coffee on the counter and moved behind my chair, his hands settling on my shoulders with a familiarity that had developed over weeks of careful attention to my comfort and well-being. His touch was warm through the soft cotton of my shirt, his fingers finding the knots of tension that had become permanent residents along my neck and upper back. "Dr. Patterson called yesterday," he said, his hands working with surprising gentleness to ease the tightness in my muscles. "She's concerned about your stress levels and wants to discuss some options for ensuring better prenatal care." The mention of my new doctor, hand-selected by Marcus from Chicago's most exclusive medical practices, reminded me of how thoroughly my life had been reorganized according to his standards of acceptable care. Dr. Patterson's office occupied an entire floor of a medical building that catered exclusively to patients whose privacy and comfort were worth paying premium rates to ensure. "I don't need better prenatal care," I said, closing the laptop with more force than necessary. "I need to feel like I have some control over my own life again." Marcus's hands stilled on my shoulders, and I felt the subtle shift in his posture that suggested I'd touched on something he considered non-negotiable. "Control," he repeated, his voice carrying that familiar note of patient authority. "Is that what you call being stalked and harassed by someone with enough influence to destroy your career? Is that what you call trying to raise a child while hiding in a studio apartment and working for minimum wage?" The questions hit their intended mark, reminding me of exactly how precarious my situation had been before Marcus's intervention. But they also highlighted the central tension that had been growing between us, his conviction that he knew what was best for me, and my increasing need to reclaim some agency over my own decisions. At least those were my choices, I said, turning in my chair to face him directly. My mistakes, my consequences, my life. Marcus studied my face with that intense focus I'd grown to recognize as his way of cataloging emotional data for future reference. Your life, he said slowly, and your child's life. The choices you make now affect someone who can't advocate for their own safety or well-being. His dark eyes moved to my abdomen, where the curve of pregnancy was now unmistakable beneath my clothing. Someone who deserves better than a mother who prioritizes independence over security. The criticism stung because it carried an uncomfortable kernel of truth. My desire for autonomy did sometimes feel selfish when weighed against my responsibility to ensure my child's safety and future opportunities. But Marcus's paternalistic approach to my protection also felt increasingly stifling as the weeks passed and my world continued to shrink. What if I wanted to go back to work? I asked, testing the boundaries of his flexibility. There's a position at Alinea that would be perfect for someone with my qualifications. Grant Akat specifically requested a meeting based on my portfolio. Marcus's expression shifted to something harder, more calculating. Alinea serves over 200 customers per night in an open environment with minimal security screening. The kitchen staff includes dozens of people whose backgrounds haven't been thoroughly vetted, and the wine storage areas provide multiple points of access that would be impossible to monitor effectively. He paused, letting the security assessment sink in. Vincent Torino has connections throughout Chicago's restaurant industry, including several people who've worked at Alinea in the past. The thoroughness of his analysis was both impressive and deeply unsettling. Marcus had clearly investigated not just the opportunity itself, but every possible angle through which my safety might be compromised. The level of thought and resources he'd devoted to cataloging potential threats was a reminder of exactly how seriously he took his role as my protector. So the answer is no, I said, though it wasn't really a question. The answer is that I won't allow you to place yourself or our child in unnecessary danger for the sake of professional satisfaction, Marcus replied, his tone carrying the finality of someone accustomed to having his decisions accepted without further argument. Our child? The phrase stopped me cold. Since when is this your child? Marcus's expression softened, but his voice remained steady. Since I became responsible for ensuring their safety and well-being. Since I started planning for their future and making decisions that will affect their opportunities and development. He moved closer, his presence filling my personal space in a way that was both comforting and overwhelming. Since I began to care about their mother, more than I've cared about anyone in a very long time. The admission hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Over the weeks of living in his space, sharing meals and conversations that ranged from wine theory to childhood memories, I'd felt the growing pull of genuine connection beneath the protective arrangement we'd constructed. Marcus was brilliant, attentive, and surprisingly gentle when he chose to be. He was also controlling, dangerous, and accustomed to solving problems through methods I preferred not to examine too closely. Marcus, I began, but he cut me off with a gesture that suggested he wasn't finished speaking. I know this isn't the arrangement you imagined when you accepted my help, he said, his voice taking on a more personal note than I'd heard before. I know you feel trapped, restricted, dependent on someone whose methods you don't entirely approve of. He paused, studying my face with that penetrating intensity. But I need you to understand that everything I've done, every limitation I've placed on your freedom, has been motivated by genuine care for your safety and that of your child. Care, I repeated, testing the word. Is that what this is? Or is this about control, about having something beautiful and rare that you can protect and display like everything else in this apartment? The question seemed to surprise him, as if the possibility that his motivations might be less than pure hadn't occurred to him. For a long moment, he was silent, his dark eyes searching my face as if looking for something he'd missed in all his careful observation. Maybe both, he said finally, his honesty more unsettling than any reassurance would have been. Maybe I do want to possess you, to keep you safe and beautiful, and close enough that I can ensure nothing ever threatens you again." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw with surprising tenderness. "But that doesn't make the care any less real, Olivia. That doesn't make my desire to protect you and your child any less genuine." The touch sent warmth spreading through my chest, a physical response that complicated my emotional resistance to his possessiveness. Marcus Castellano was offering me something I'd never had before: absolute security, unwavering support, and the kind of devoted attention that felt like being cherished rather than simply desired. "What happens when you get tired of protecting me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What happens when the novelty wears off and you decide this arrangement isn't worth the trouble anymore?" Marcus's smile was sharp and certain, carrying the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his own determination. "That's not going to happen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "You're not a novelty, Olivia. You're not temporary entertainment or a charitable project." His hand moved to cover mine, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt like a promise. "You're the woman who's going to change everything about how I see the world, and I'm the man who's going to make sure nothing ever hurts you again." The declaration should have felt overwhelming, possessive, frightening in its implications. Instead, as I sat there in Marcus Castellano's kitchen, with his hand warm over mine and his dark eyes full of promises I'd never thought I'd hear, I felt something I'd thought was lost forever, beginning to bloom in my chest. The possibility of being truly, completely safe in someone else's care. The wine cellar beneath Marcus's penthouse stretched into shadows that spoke of both passion and obsession, its climate-controlled environment housing collections that represented decades of careful acquisition and expertise that rivaled any sommelier's dreams. I'd discovered this space 3 weeks ago while exploring the building's lower levels, and it had quickly become my refuge when the weight of protection began to feel more like imprisonment than safety. Tonight, however, the cellar felt different. Marcus had followed me down here after dinner, his presence filling the space between the towering wine racks with an energy that suggested important conversations were about to unfold. At 7 months pregnant, I moved more carefully through the narrow aisles, my expanded silhouette requiring adjustments that reminded me daily of how much my life had changed since that first evening at the restaurant. 1982. Bordeaux? I said, running my fingers along the labels of a particularly impressive section. Latour, Margaux, Aubryon. This collection is worth more than most people's houses. It's worth nothing if there's no one to share it with, Marcus replied, his voice carrying an undertone I hadn't heard before. He moved closer, his presence warm in the cool air of the cellar. Wine is meant to mark occasions, to celebrate moments that matter. A collection this extensive becomes meaningless without someone who understands its significance. I turned to face him, noting the careful way he'd positioned himself between me and the cellar's exit. The gesture might have seemed casual to anyone else, but I'd learned to read the subtle signals of Marcus's protective instincts. Tonight, however, something felt different about his positioning. Less protective, more possessive. You're not talking about wine, I observed, my hand instinctively moving to rest on my rounded abdomen where the baby had been particularly active throughout the evening. No, Marcus admitted, his dark eyes never leaving my face. I'm talking about the fact that Vincent Torino was seen in Chicago yesterday. I'm talking about the fact that my sources indicate he's been asking very specific questions about your whereabouts and current situation. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but somehow more commanding than any shout. I'm talking about the fact that your period of safety may be coming to an end. The revelation hit me like ice water, washing away the comfortable routine I'd built around doctor appointments, prenatal vitamins, and the gradual acceptance of Marcus's protective oversight. Vincent's reappearance meant that the careful distance I'd maintained from my past was about to collapse entirely. "What kind of questions?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. Marcus's expression grew darker, more predatory. "Questions about your pregnancy, about who's been providing you with protection, about whether you've been foolish enough to think you could hide from him permanently." He paused, his gaze moving to my abdomen with something that looked like fierce possessiveness. "Questions about whether the child you're carrying might be leverage worth pursuing." Fear coursed through my veins like liquid electricity. The one thing I'd hoped Vincent would never discover, that my pregnancy might be useful to him, had apparently become his primary focus. The implications of his interest sent nausea rolling through my stomach in waves that had nothing to do with my condition. "He can't touch me here," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Your security, the building's protocols, are excellent for deterring casual threats," Marcus interrupted. "But Vincent Torino isn't casual about anything, and he has resources that rival my own in some areas." His hands found my shoulders, his touch gentle but his grip firm enough to ensure I couldn't look away from what he was about to tell me. "More importantly, he has something I don't. The absolute certainty that he has a legal claim to both you and your child." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" Marcus's expression grew grim, the look of someone delivering news that would shatter carefully constructed illusions. "Vincent has been building a case that you're mentally unstable, that you fled New York in a state of psychological crisis that makes you unfit to care for a child. He's prepared to petition for custody based on your abandonment of your career, your inability to maintain stable employment, and your current dependence on a man he'll characterize as dangerous and unstable." Each point of Vincent's strategy felt like another nail in the coffin of my autonomy. The systematic way he'd destroyed my professional reputation suddenly made perfect sense, not just as punishment for leaving him, but as preparation for a custody battle that would give him complete control over both my child and my future. "He can't do that," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. "He can try," Marcus replied grimly, and with his connections in family court, his documented attempts to help you professionally, and his ability to present himself as a stable, successful father figure, he might succeed. His hands tightened slightly on my shoulders. "Unless you have someone equally powerful willing to stand with you, someone whose resources and influence can match his own." The implication hung between us like a bridge to a future I wasn't sure I was prepared to cross. Marcus was offering me more than protection now. He was offering partnership in a battle that would determine not just my freedom, but my child's entire future. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Marcus stepped closer, his presence filling my personal space with warmth and the subtle scent of expensive cologne and underlying danger. "Marriage," he said simply. "Legal partnership that gives me standing to protect both you and your child, that provides the kind of stability and legitimacy that courts respect." His dark eyes searched my face for any sign of my reaction. "A union that makes it very clear to Vincent Torino that pursuing you means going through me." The proposal should have felt overwhelming, rushed, like a solution that created more problems than it solved. Instead, as I stood there in Marcus's wine cellar, surrounded by treasures accumulated over years of patient dedication, I found myself considering the offer with something approaching relief. "You're asking me to marry you to spite Vincent Torino," I said, testing the boundaries of his motivation. "I'm asking you to marry me because I've spent the past 4 months falling in love with your intelligence, your strength, your refusal to be broken by someone who tried to destroy you completely." Marcus's voice carried a sincerity that seemed to surprise even him. "I'm asking you to marry me because the thought of Vincent Torino having any claim to you or your child makes me want to burn down everything he's ever built." His hand moved to cover mine where it rested on my abdomen. "I'm asking you to marry me because I want to give your child my name, my protection, and every advantage my resources can provide. The declaration hung between us like a promise and a threat simultaneously. Marriage to Marcus Castellano would solve the immediate problem of Vincent's legal maneuvering, but it would also bind me permanently to a man whose business operated in shadows and whose methods of problem-solving I preferred not to examine too closely. "And what do you get out of this arrangement?" I asked, needing to understand the full scope of what he was offering. Marcus's smile was sharp and possessive, carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd finally identified what he wanted most in the world. "I get you," he said simply. "I get to wake up every morning knowing that you're safe, that your child is protected, that no one can ever again make you feel small or frightened or alone." His thumb traced across my knuckles with surprising gentleness. "I get to spend the rest of my life proving that some kinds of protection are worth accepting." The offer represented everything I'd thought I'd lost when Vincent destroyed my career. Security, partnership, the possibility of building something meaningful with someone who valued what I brought to the relationship. But it also represented a different kind of surrender. Not to fear and intimidation, but to care and devotion that might be equally consuming. As I stood there in Marcus's wine cellar, surrounded by treasures that spoke of patience and long-term planning, I realized I was facing the most important choice of my life. I could continue fighting for an independence that Vincent would never allow me to keep, or I could accept the protection of a man whose love felt as dangerous and intoxicating as the rarest vintage in his collection. "Yes," I said finally, the word feeling like both an ending and a beginning. "Yes, I'll marry you." Marcus's smile was triumphant and tender simultaneously, and as he pulled me into his arms with careful attention to my pregnant form, I felt something I'd thought was lost forever settling into my chest. The absolute certainty that I would never have to face my fears alone again. 3 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our penthouse, our home now, legally and emotionally, watching Marcus prepare breakfast while our daughter slept peacefully in her bassinet nearby. Lucia had arrived 2 weeks early, as if eager to enter a world where she was already completely cherished and protected. The morning sun streamed through windows that no longer felt like barriers, but like frames for a life I'd never imagined possible. Vincent Torino had withdrawn his custody petition the day after our wedding announcement appeared in the Chicago Tribune, apparently deciding that challenging Marcus Castellano's legal claim to his family wasn't worth the inevitable consequences. "She's going to wake up hungry soon," Marcus observed, glancing at our daughter with the expression of wonder that had become his default whenever he looked at her. "She's going to wake up safe," I replied, the words carrying weight that only someone who'd feared for their child's future could fully appreciate. Marcus moved behind my chair, his hands settling on my shoulders in the gesture that had become our morning ritual. "Safe," he agreed, his voice carrying the satisfaction of promises kept. "Loved, protected, and surrounded by people who will move mountains to ensure she has every opportunity to become exactly who she's meant to be." As Lucia stirred in her sleep, making the small sounds that preceded her demands for attention, I reflected on the choice that had brought us to this moment. I'd traded my independence for protection, my solitude for partnership, my uncertainty for a love that felt as vast and complex as Marcus's wine collection. It hadn't been the future I'd planned, but it was the future I'd chosen. And as Marcus lifted our daughter from her bassinet with the gentle confidence that had become second nature to him, I knew it was exactly the future we all deserved. 5 years had passed since that first evening when Marcus Castellano had challenged my knowledge of wine and inadvertently unraveled the careful anonymity I'd constructed around my shattered life. Now, as I stood in the tasting room of Harper Castellano Vineyards, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across rows of meticulously tended vines stretching toward the Napa Valley horizon, I marveled at how completely my world had transformed. The vineyard had been Marcus's wedding gift to me. Not just the property itself, but the opportunity to build something entirely our own, removed from the shadows of his Chicago operations and the wine counterfeiting network that had ultimately led to my mentor's downfall. What had begun as a gesture of love had evolved into something far more significant. A legitimate empire that showcased everything I'd learned about wine, while providing Marcus with the kind of clean, respectable business he'd never imagined wanting. "Mama, the grapes are turning purple." Lucia's voice carried across the tasting room as she pressed her face against the floor-to-ceiling windows, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the harvest crews moving through the vineyard with practiced efficiency. At 4 years old, she possessed an uncanny ability to identify the subtle changes that marked each stage of the growing season, as if her palate had inherited my sensitivity to the nuances that made great wine possible. "That means they're almost ready," I replied, moving to stand beside her and placing my hand on her dark hair, so like her father's in color and texture, but with my stubborn cowlick that refused to be tamed. "In a few more weeks, we'll pick them and begin the process of turning them into wine." "Like the bottles in Daddy's special room?" she asked, referring to the climate-controlled cellar Marcus had constructed beneath our house, where he'd relocated the most precious portions of his Chicago collection. "Exactly like those," I confirmed, though I knew it would be years before the wines we were producing here would achieve the complexity and value of the vintages Marcus had spent decades acquiring. Still, early reviews from wine critics had been promising, and our small-batch releases were developing the kind of following that suggested Harper Castellano might eventually earn a place among Napa's most respected producers. The sound of footsteps on the hardwood floors announced Marcus's arrival, though I'd sensed his presence before he entered the room. After 5 years of marriage, I'd developed an acute awareness of his movements and moods, just as he'd learned to read the subtle signals that indicated my thoughts and concerns. The connection between us had deepened far beyond the protective arrangement that had brought us together, evolving into something that felt as essential as breathing. "The FBI wants to schedule a final deposition," he said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he used when discussing anything related to his former life. The investigation into Vincent Torino's wine counterfeiting operation had taken 3 years to complete, resulting in convictions that had effectively dismantled one of the most sophisticated fraud networks in the industry's history. Marcus's cooperation with federal prosecutors had been comprehensive and devastating, providing evidence that had led to prison sentences for dozens of people involved in the scheme. "When?" I asked, though I'd been expecting this moment for months. The legal proceedings were finally reaching their conclusion, marking the end of our connection to the events that had brought us together. "Next week in San Francisco. Agent Rodriguez says it should be the last time they need either of us to testify." Marcus moved to stand beside me at the window, his hand finding the small of my back in the gesture that had become our routine whenever he sensed my anxiety about revisiting the past. "After this, it's over. Completely." The finality of his words should have brought relief, but instead, I felt a strange melancholy at the thought of closing this chapter entirely. The investigation had served as a bridge between our old lives and our new reality, a reminder of how far we'd traveled from that evening in Castellano's restaurant, when I'd been hiding behind a false identity, and he'd been running a criminal empire. "Vincent's appeal was denied," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the harder edge that appeared whenever he discussed my former mentor. "He'll serve the full 25 years, without possibility of parole. Vincent Torino's conviction for racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy had been the crown jewel of the federal case. The evidence Marcus had provided, financial records, shipping documents, recordings of conversations, had painted a picture of systematic criminality that went far beyond wine counterfeiting. Vincent's attempts to destroy my career had been revealed as part of a broader pattern of intimidation and control that had affected dozens of people over the years. "Good," I said, and meant it. The fear that had driven me into hiding had long since transformed into something approaching pity for a man whose need for control had ultimately destroyed everything he'd built. Maybe now some of his other victims can finally feel safe. Lucia had grown bored with grape observation, and was now arranging wine glasses on one of the tasting tables, with the meticulous care of someone who'd spent her entire life around fragile, valuable objects. Her comfort in this environment still amazed me. She moved through the vineyard and winery with the confidence of someone who belonged here completely, unaware that her parents had once inhabited a much darker world. Mr. Chen called about the harvest celebration, Marcus said, referring to our vineyard manager, whose expertise had been crucial in establishing our reputation for quality. He thinks we should expect about 300 guests this year, including several distributors from New York and Los Angeles. The annual harvest celebration had become one of Napa Valley's most anticipated events, drawing wine enthusiasts, industry professionals, and food writers who were eager to experience our unique approach to viticulture and hospitality. What had begun as a small gathering of neighbors and friends had evolved into a showcase that generated significant revenue and helped establish our brand in competitive markets. 300, I repeated, my mind automatically shifting into the logistical planning mode that had become second nature over the years of building our business. We'll need additional staffing for the tasting room and extra security for the cellar tours. Already arranged, Marcus replied, his smile carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd anticipated my concerns before I'd voiced them. I've also hired a photographer to document the event for the website and social media campaign. The business aspects of wine production had surprised me with their complexity and depth. Creating exceptional wine required not just knowledge of viticulture and enology, but understanding of marketing, distribution, regulatory compliance, and customer service. Marcus's background in managing complex operations had proved invaluable in navigating these challenges, while my expertise in wine evaluation and food pairing had provided the foundation for our product development. "Mama, can I help with the grape picking?" Lucia asked, abandoning her glass arrangement to join our conversation. Her dark eyes, so much like Marcus's in their intensity and intelligence, held the kind of eager curiosity that made it impossible to refuse her requests for involvement in vineyard activities. "You can help carry the small baskets," I said, knowing that her participation would last approximately 15 minutes before she became distracted by something more immediately interesting. "But you have to promise to listen to Mr. Chen and stay away from the machinery." "I promise," she declared with the absolute sincerity of someone who genuinely intended to keep her word, even if circumstances might eventually prove otherwise. Marcus lifted her into his arms with the easy strength that had become more pronounced over years of manual labor in the vineyard. The physical transformation of our lives had been one of the unexpected benefits of leaving Chicago. Both of us had developed the kind of fitness that came from daily work in agriculture, replacing gym memberships with actual productive activity. "Speaking of promises," Marcus said, his attention shifting back to me with an expression that suggested important conversations were approaching. "I've been thinking about our 5-year plan and some adjustments we might want to consider." The 5-year plan had been our method of ensuring that our transition from Marcus's criminal enterprises to legitimate business remained on track. Every major decision was evaluated against long-term goals that prioritized both financial success and personal happiness, with regular reviews to assess our progress and identify necessary changes. "What kind of adjustments?" I asked, though I suspected I knew where this conversation was heading. Marcus set Lucia down and moved closer, his hands finding my waist with the familiarity of someone who'd memorized every detail of my body over years of intimate partnership. "The kind that might involve expanding our family," he said, his voice taking on the gentle tone he used when discussing subjects that affected our future together. The suggestion shouldn't have surprised me. We'd talked about having more children since before Lucia was born, but the timing felt significant given our approaching freedom from legal obligations and the stability our business had achieved. "Another baby?" Lucia asked, her attention immediately captured by the possibility of a sibling. "Can we have a boy this time?" "We don't get to choose," I laughed, though the idea of another child sent warmth spreading through my chest. "Babies come however they come." "But we can hope for healthy," Marcus added, his hand moving to rest protectively over my abdomen in a gesture that transported me back to those early months when his care had felt overwhelming rather than cherished. The parallels between our current conversation and that first pregnancy weren't lost on me. Then, I'd been terrified, alone, fleeing from someone who'd tried to control every aspect of my life. Now I was discussing expanding our family with a man whose protection had evolved into partnership, whose possessiveness had transformed into devotion that felt as natural as breathing. I think, I said slowly, considering not just the practicalities, but the emotional readiness that would be required for another child, that our family could use another member. Marcus's smile was brilliant and victorious, carrying the same satisfaction I'd seen that night in his wine cellar when I'd agreed to marry him. But this time, there was no desperation driving the decision, no external threats forcing choices we weren't ready to make. This was simply two people who'd built something beautiful together deciding to expand what they'd created. Really? Lucia asked, her excitement building as she processed the implications. When? Can I help name the baby? Can I teach them about grapes? Slow down, I laughed, catching her hands as she began bouncing with anticipation. First we have to make a baby, then we have to wait 9 months for them to arrive, and then you can teach them everything you know about the vineyard. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower across the valley, painting the landscape in the golden tones that made this area famous among photographers and artists. The harvest crews had finished their work for the day, leaving the vineyard quiet, except for the distant sound of equipment being cleaned and stored for tomorrow's activities. I need to check on the fermentation tanks, Marcus said, though his reluctance to leave our family conversation was evident in his tone. The Cabernet from Block 7 has been developing some interesting characteristics that might require adjustment. Go, I said, recognizing the note of professional concern that appeared whenever he suspected something in the winemaking process needed attention. Lucia and I will work on dinner preparations. As Marcus headed toward the production facility, I watched him move across the courtyard with the confident stride of someone who'd found his place in the world. The transformation from criminal enterprise to legitimate business had been more complete than either of us had imagined possible. The man who'd once solved problems through intimidation and violence now spent his days analyzing soil samples and debating the merits of different oak barrel treatments. Mama, Lucia said, tugging on my hand to regain my attention. Will the new baby like wine as much as we do? The question made me smile, highlighting the surreal normalcy our lives had achieved. Our daughter was growing up in an environment where wine was craft and business rather than simple beverage, where understanding terroir and vintage variation was as natural as learning to read and write. They'll learn to appreciate good wine when they're older, I said, leading her toward the house where dinner preparations awaited. Just like you're learning. As we walked through the courtyard, past the fountain Marcus had installed to commemorate our first successful harvest, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. 5 years ago, I'd been a woman in hiding, pregnant and terrified, serving wine to people who would never appreciate the knowledge I'd worked years to acquire. Tonight, I was the co-owner of a respected vineyard, married to a man who'd transformed his life as completely as I'd transformed mine, raising a daughter who would grow up with opportunities I'd never imagined possible. The investigation that had consumed so much of our early years together was finally ending. Vincent Torino was in prison where he could never again hurt anyone, and our business was thriving beyond our most optimistic projections. More importantly, our marriage had evolved from protective arrangement to genuine partnership, built on mutual respect, shared goals, and love that had deepened with each year we'd spent building our new life together. As I helped Lucia wash grapes for our evening snack, fruit from our own vines, grown in soil we'd cultivated and improved, I thought about the choices that had led us here. Every decision, from accepting Marcus's initial protection to agreeing to marry him to leaving Chicago for California, had required faith in possibilities I couldn't fully envision at the time. Now, as the sun set over Harper Castellano vineyards, and my husband returned from the production facility with dirt under his fingernails and satisfaction in his eyes, I understood that the best wines and the best lives required patience, attention, and willingness to trust in processes that couldn't be rushed or controlled. We'd taken the raw materials of our damaged past and transformed them into something rich, complex, and worth preserving. Like the vintages aging in our cellars, our love had required time to develop its full potential. But the result was something that would only improve with age. "The Cabernet is going to be exceptional," Marcus announced as he joined us in the kitchen, his excitement about the winemaking process still fresh after years of learning and refinement. "Chen thinks it might be our best vintage yet." "High praise from someone who's worked with the best producers in the valley," I replied, feeling the pride that came from creating something genuinely excellent through dedication and expertise. As we prepared dinner together, Marcus handling the proteins while I selected wines to complement the meal, Lucia setting the table with the careful attention to detail that reflected her upbringing in an environment where presentation mattered. I realized this was exactly the life I'd dreamed of during those dark months when the future had seemed impossible to navigate. We were no longer running from the past or hiding from threats we couldn't control. We were building something lasting, creating legacy that would benefit not just our family, but the broader community of people who appreciated exceptional wine and genuine hospitality. The evening stretched ahead of us, filled with the simple pleasures of good food, great wine, and conversation that ranged from harvest projections to Lucia's progress in preschool to plans for our next family vacation. These were the moments that had replaced the adrenaline-fueled drama of our early relationship. Quieter, deeper, infinitely more satisfying. As I watched Marcus pour glasses of our 2019 Estate Pinot Noir, the wine that had earned our first major critical recognition, I thought about the complexity that great vintages required. The best wines were never simple or one-dimensional. They revealed different characteristics as they developed, offering new discoveries with each tasting, improving year after year until they reached their perfect moment of maturity. Our marriage had followed a similar trajectory, beginning with intense circumstances that had masked the subtler qualities that would prove most important over time. What had started as protective arrangement had revealed layers of compatibility, shared values, and genuine affection that continued to surprise us both. "To our family," Marcus said, raising his glass in the evening toast that had become our tradition. "To the choices that brought us together and the future we're building." "To second chances," I added, thinking of all the ways our lives had been transformed by the willingness to trust in possibilities that had seemed impossible. "And to love, that gets better with age." As we touched glasses and shared the wine we'd created together, I felt the profound satisfaction that came from knowing we'd taken the worst chapters of our individual stories and transformed them into the foundation for something beautiful. The investigation was ending. Our business was thriving. Our daughter was happy and healthy. And we were planning to expand our family from a position of strength rather than fear. This was our vintage year. The moment when everything we'd worked for had reached its perfect maturity, ready to be savored and celebrated. And like the finest wines in our collection, I knew our love would only continue to improve with time, developing new depths and complexities that would surprise and delight us for decades to come. The future stretched ahead of us, unwritten but no longer uncertain, filled with harvests yet to come and wines yet to be crafted, children yet to be raised and memories yet to be made. We'd learned that the best things in life, like the best wines, couldn't be rushed or forced. They required patience, attention, and faith in the gradual process of transformation that turned simple ingredients into something extraordinary. As the last light faded from the Napa Valley sky and our family settled into the comfortable rhythms of evening, I knew with absolute certainty that we'd found our place in the world. Not just geographically, but emotionally and spiritually. A space where our pasts informed but didn't define us, where our present was rich and satisfying, and where our future promised continued growth and development. We'd started with secrets and protection, but we'd created something much more valuable. A partnership built on complete honesty, mutual respect and love that had been tested by circumstances and emerged stronger for the trials. This was our legacy, growing in the soil we'd chosen to cultivate, aging gracefully toward a future that would be even more beautiful than anything we could imagine today.